Back in Scotland, news of the first party was eagerly awaited. John McGlashan took the best bits out of some of the first letters received from Otago and packaged them up with other information in his The Otago Journal, a promotional magazine whose first number appeared even as the John Wycliffe and Philip Lang were still en route. From his office here in Edinburgh's South Hanover Street, McGlashan energetically publicised Otago and carefully selected immigrants to go there. Well, down in London, the New Zealand company organised one more ship to leave from Greenock and another 15 from Gravesend in fulfilment of its obligations to the scheme. Burns and Cargill were very happy with McGlashan's selections, which fitted more closely with the Free Church and Scottish ideal than they had been able to manage. Captain Cargill expressed his satisfaction in a letter to McGlashan in early 1849.
I would here repeat my unqualified satisfaction with the character of the people you have sent, and my gratification in having found every successful arrival to be an improvement on the preceding one.
The only problem was that Otago land wasn't selling. The price was too high, and kept so deliberately to fund the whole scheme. But without income from land sales, the whole Otago settlement scheme was simply not viable as an investment for its New Zealand company's shareholders.
Because the whole idea was that they could get the land cheap and sell it dear to the settlers to get enough money, not just for profit for the shareholders, but also to develop the colony.
By 1850, only 12,000 acres had been sold, whereas the required sales target was 60,000 acres. This had brought in just £24,000 instead of £120,000. And the cost of sending ships to Otago and setting up infrastructure there had exceeded the income by £27,000. This was just not sustainable for a profit-driven venture. The company folded as a colonising body on the 4th of July 1850. All of its assets and liabilities were then taken over by the British government. The last migrant ship organised by the New Zealand Company for Otago was the Phoebe Dunbar, which set sail from London in July 1850. The Otago Association limped on until 1852 before it too was wound up. John McGlashan then took ship himself on the Raja and joined the settlers in Otago in 1853. He built a cottage here in the hills above Dunedin, an area that he called Balmacuen in honour of his wife, Isabella McEwen. McGlashan quickly emerged as a key player in the settlement and held a number of important positions in the provincial administration before his death in a riding accident in 1864. John McGlashan College, Dunedin's famous Presbyterian school for boys, was established in 1918 in his old home, thanks to a bequest to the Presbyterian Church from McGlashan's daughters. The demise of the New Zealand Company in 1850 left something of a vacuum of direction in Dunedin, affecting land sales and development work in particular. Though the British government had taken over the company's assets, it did not have the same interest in developing Otago, and a long period of stagnation ensued until the middle 1850s, when the Otago provincial government came into being. Hardest hit in this period were the wage labourers who'd been dependent on the New Zealand Company works for their incomes and for the small sections that they rented. But fortunately, there were plenty of places around Dunedin where you could squat rent-free, and lots of birds and pigs in the bush to be hunted for food. No one needed to starve in early Otago. With the demise of the New Zealand Company, prospective settlers of the early 1850s had to find their own way to Otago. This was no mean feat when 18,000 kilometres of ocean lay between Britain and the new Edinburgh of Dunedin. Not surprisingly, new arrivals slowed to a trickle in this period. But one outstanding Otago pioneer settler did make that vast journey at his own initiative: the remarkable and energetic James McAndrew. McAndrew was born in Aberdeen, but he had come down to London as an 18-year-old, like many young Scots looking to make their way in the world. He rose quickly through the ranks of the various businesses that he worked for here, and by 1850 he was actually in business on his own account as a merchant here on Dowgate Hill in central London. He was also one of the earliest and most active supporters of the Otago Association's London Committee, and an enthusiastic member of the Free Church congregation of the Scotch Church at London Wall, around which the Otago scheme's London activities were based. He'd also invested in Otago land, and despite the collapse of the New Zealand Company, he was still keen to join the settlers out there. But how was he going to get there? Well, in typical McAndrew fashion, he thought big. In mid-1850, he commissioned a small schooner, the Titan, loaded it up with merchandise for sale in Otago, and advertised for paying passengers to accompany him. Now, there were no takers for the ads, but undismayed, McAndrew convinced 19 members of his extended family, including his in-laws, the Reynolds, some staff and a few friends to join him, and on the 7th of September 1850, they set sail from London for Otago.
He just had drive. I think that's what it was the place needed. And it was the drive of a young, ambitious man.
McAndrew was 31 when he arrived in Dunedin, and he hit the ground running with that bluff, big picture thinking and boosterism that was to be the hallmark of his colonial career. He opened a store, became a local magistrate, and was quickly involved in everything that was going on in the settlement. His investment in his various schemes kick-started the local economy, and whatever else you might say about him, and he clearly had his faults, McAndrew's arrival boosted the morale of the settlers in Dunedin.
But he was also a risk taker. Now, that's the opposite of Cargill, who wasn't known for taking any risk anywhere, whereas this other guy was this sort of relentless entrepreneur who just wanted to keep expanding and growing things and taking risks.
He was so full of confidence, so bursting with grand ideas for Dunedin's future, that everyone felt just a little bit cheered up. They certainly needed a bit of cheering up too. Things were proving pretty tough on the ground for the earliest arrivals, as well as the mud and the physical challenges involved in building houses and forming roads and drains across the steep bush-clad hills of the township. There was also a shortage of basic commodities and really high prices for those that were available. As A.H. McClintock wrote in his Centennial History of Otago,
"The lot of the poor in these early years was exceedingly hard, and the struggle for existence a desperate one."
But perhaps worse than that, because whoever thought pioneering was going to be easy, was the lack of social harmony.
For a relatively small place with an underwhelming population, there was an incredible amount of unproductive niggle amongst the leading citizens of Dunedin in that first decade.
A period at least, that is Dunedin, a semi-theocracy, and free church regulation, intervention, the cult of evangelicalism, which was absolutely central to the free church, was the principal set of ideologies moulding the new settlement.
The original Wakefieldian ideal of an exclusively Scottish and free church paradise in the South Seas had never really been a goer, once the free church congregations in Scotland proved unwilling or unable to provide enough recruits to make it a reality. And instead, a large minority of the very earliest arrivals were neither Scottish nor Presbyterian.
They were a small group, mainly the English, but luckily for Otago, enough of them came to put a bit of capital into the place. Without that capital, the whole thing probably would have fallen over.
And not surprisingly, these folks, who were mostly English and either Anglican or Wesleyan, quickly began to resent the dominance of the free church leadership in Dunedin and the privileges accorded to the Presbyterians. Now, to be fair, a privileged position for the Presbyterians was part of the scheme that the English settlers had signed up for, literally. The regulations they had assented to clearly set out that 1/8 of all money from land sales would go to support churches, schools, ministers and teachers. Those churches, ministers and teachers were definitely intended to be under free church control, the very battle that Burns and Cargill had fought with Rennie in the genesis of the scheme. Once on the ground in Otago, however, the outsiders began to push back and demand more inclusive arrangements. We've already seen how the two original barracks buildings erected along the Dunedin foreshore were known as the Scotch barracks and the English barracks respectively, and that gives us a clue as to how important those national differences were here in Otago from day one. The Free Church leadership of the settlement early on derided the non-Scots among them as the little enemy, and that was a name that stuck and gives a sense of the frustration experienced by the Free Church leaders of how that Wakefieldian ideal of a Scottish and Presbyterian settlement was compromised from within right from the beginning.
They clashed, and they clashed because of culture, because of language, because of expectation, and because of religion. So it's highly unlikely they were going to get on, and they didn't, by and large.
One man would come to epitomise those tensions more than any other. Now this is Forbury Gardens in Reid in Berkshire, one of the leafy southern counties of England. It's also the birthplace of William Henry Valpy, who would bring that name Forbury to Otago. He was born here into a prosperous family in 1793, and after his schooling at Eton and a short stint in the Royal Navy, he embarked on a 30-year career as a judge in India. He came back to England in 1838 to retire, but his health had been damaged by his years in the East, and he was advised to seek a better climate in the colonies. Now, for some reason I just cannot imagine, he chose Otago as his therapeutic destination. And in late 1848, he set sail on the Ajax with his wife and 5 grown children. Now, this really was quite a catch for the struggling settlement in Dunedin. Valpy was reputed to be the wealthiest man in New Zealand on his arrival, and in demonstration of this, he brought with him a large staff of servants, a considerable quantity of coinage, as well as the complete workings of a flour mill and a sawmill. Valpy selected 120 acres of land here at St Clair, and he called it Forbury after his birthplace. Acquiring further land on the flat, he called it Caversham after his mother's birthplace. The Valpy's party roughed it like everyone else for the first few months, but quickly built an impressive stone house there on the slope above what is now Valpy Street. From this Forbury, he operated as the very ideal of Wakefield's gentry class, employed large numbers of Scottish labourers on his farm, and to build a road. This road, from Dunedin out to his property and on to the beach at St Clair. Now, he paid well and he treated his workers well, putting on harvest home festivals at the end of every season. And though he was an Anglican, he also warmly supported Thomas Burns and attended his Free Church services. The judge's daughters, meanwhile, had some of the few horses in Dunedin and took great delight in riding widely around the settlement, recording its appearance in some fine watercolour paintings and sketches. No other pioneer women had the same leisure time and freedom of movement or the artistic skills to do this. The Valpy girls' work thus provides a rare pictorial record of Dunedin in its primeval state. And the girls also provided some of the most eligible brides for Dunedin's leading families, albeit the Anglican little enemy ones. What could go wrong? Well, everything changed after the granting of self-government provisions to the New Zealand colony when Governor Grey appointed Valpy to be the sole Otago representative on a newly created Legislative Council in Wellington. Captain Cargill, who had previously feted the judge, now turned on him in fury, incensed that the Scottish settlement would be represented by an Englishman. He demanded that Valpy decline the appointment, and when the judge refused, he mounted a bitter public attack on him.
George Grey, that was where the other clash came, because Grey appointed these people up in Auckland, as the capital was in those days, and they came down here. Hardly any of them got on with the Scots at all. They basically clashed.
Greatly shocked by the abuse directed at him, and with no respite from the ill health which had brought him to Otago in the first place, Valpy died in September 1852 without ever taking up his seat on the council in Wellington. Valpy wasn't the only member of the little enemy who was hounded to his death by the old captain. Henry Graham was a 42-year-old printer from Carlisle in northern England who came to Otago on the Blundell in 1848 with his wife Jane, their infant daughter and Graham's sister. But he also brought with him lead type and a printing press with a view to establishing a newspaper in Dunedin, a scheme in which he was warmly encouraged by John McGlashan back in Edinburgh, who realised just what an asset a newspaper would be to the infant colony in Otago. Graham's publication, the Otago News, Otago's first newspaper, duly appeared for the first time on the 13th of December 1848 with the curious motto on its masthead, "There's pippins and cheese to come." Alas, Graham was of the wrong sort. An Englishman and an Anglican, and worse, much, much worse, a man of independent mind who saw his paper as a vehicle for discussion and criticism if need be, including of the New Zealand Company and the settlement's leaders.
There was a man called Graham, was the first editor of the Otago News, and he couldn't stand Cargill. And he also thought that Cargill was something like a mafia boss. Graham wanted the place to be a bit more liberated and freer.
Captain Cargill, of course, had very different ideas. His ideal newspaper was more like McGlashan's Otago Journal, a voice piece for the leadership and a relentlessly positive propaganda vehicle for the Otago settlement. When Graham's fifth issue published a direct criticism of Cargill's core policy, contiguity and concentration, by which he meant the settlers should develop their farms close together around Dunedin, and instead suggested land further south, right down to the Clutha, would be the best prospect for agricultural developments, he had committed a cardinal sin. Cargill promptly withdrew all the official subscriptions to the newspaper, which meant that it was no longer financially viable, and drove Graham towards his critics further, the little enemy, and meant that all the future issues of the paper were full of dissent and controversy. Now, it was incidents like this that made Otago a byword for sectarian discord in New Zealand and overseas through the 1850s. But for Graham, the end was nigh. The last issue came out in December 1850, and 2 months later he died, worn out by the struggle, killed by tuberculosis. And now all that we have to remember him by is this unmarked grave in Port Chalmers. Agriculture was theoretically to be the core of the Otago settlement's economy. But many of the early settlers lacked agricultural experience, and they were slow to embark on the development of their rural sections on the Taieri. The plain, though rich in potential, was too waterlogged and needed to be drained before it could be turned into farmland. Indeed, the settlers instead clustered around Dunedin, working up garden plots on their small urban and suburban sections there, or they developed small trading enterprises. 2 years after settlement had begun, no one had yet put a plough to use on the Taieri or begun the hard slog of draining it. It was actually a Scottish Catholic, Neil McGregor from Caithness, who, by virtue of his religious affiliation, was one of the little enemy, who was among the first to begin this work after his arrival in Otago in March 1850 on the ship Berkshire. McGregor was a man who brought capital to Otago and was therefore able to employ labourers to help him break in the land. His holdings spread out across the Silver Stream area and eventually built up to over 10,000 acres. Indeed, apart from his religious affiliation, McGregor was the ideal sort of settler for the Otago scheme, a man with enough money to develop his land and employ labour. But woe betide any slackers. It was said that if you proved to be a poor workman, McGregor would give you a length of rope with your final pay, just enough to go hang yourself with. Meanwhile, on the far western side of the plain, on land that was slightly higher and slightly drier, a small cluster of early arrivals had set up in the bush at what is now called Woodside. Francis McDermott and his nephew William were passengers on the Philip Lang. Francis, however, originally came from Clackmannanshire, but by the time the 1841 Scottish census was taken, he was farming here at Thornhill in Kincardine parish near Stirling. Now, historians have identified such moves from place to place within Scotland as excellent psychological preparation for ultimately moving further afield, emigrating abroad. And such was the case with Francis, who 6 years later bought one of the land packages of the New Zealand company that entitled him and his nephew to free passages on the first ship to Otago. Francis, at 47, was considerably older than most of the pioneers, but as an experienced tenant farmer here in Scotland, he would have realised better than most the golden opportunity that a fresh start in New Zealand offered him to actually own land in his own right. He would also have realised the advantage of having a colonial helpmeet, because just a few months after arrival, the old bachelor married one of his fellow passengers on the voyage out, 25-year-old Janet Milne. Now, Janet was actually the sister of James Adams' wife, Margaret, the woman from Aberdeen who had been so reluctant to emigrate. And it was actually Janet agreeing to come with her that had finally reconciled Margaret to the idea of the move to Otago. Despite being over 30 kilometres from Dunedin across a trackless bog, the McDermotts took up their rural holding here at Woodside in 1848. Now, they started with a whare and graduated to a wattle and daub hut, but they lived through some pretty hard years here. One stage in the early days, when food ran out, they had to walk through waist-deep water and slush to the Maori Kaik at Henley, where they were received hospitably and given eels and mutton birds to keep them going. And Francis regularly walked the 35 kilometres to Dunedin for supplies, carrying them home on his back. He often did the trip in one day, sometimes accompanied by his wife, who would carry her child with her. Well, those are the stories handed down anyway. I'm not sure how they got on once the family expanded to 3 sons and 5 daughters, but by the 1860s, the McDermotts were in a completely different situation. The gold rush had made this spot a key way station on the road inland to the goldfields, and Francis prospered mightily from his earlier investments. This house was one result, constructed in 1866 in the Scottish baronial style and lived in by 3 generations of the family over the next century. Janet died here in 1881 in her late 50s, but Francis survived until 1897. When he died at the age of 96, he was one of Otago's real patriarchs, whose midlife gamble in coming here had clearly paid off. The McDermotts were joined here in 1849 by the Fulton brothers, James and Robert, who were 18 and 16 respectively, and of Northern Irish origin. They too began their life here in pretty primitive circumstances, living in a fern tree hut with bunks around a central fireplace, while they looked after a flock of sheep for another early settler. But they were really just slumming it in those sort of primitive conditions, being really young men of considerable means who'd come out on the Ajax with the Valpys. James would soon marry Judge Valpy's daughter Catherine and begin to improve his living conditions. In due course, in fact, he and Catherine established a substantial farming estate here with a magnificent house, Ravenscliff, and a fine garden. The water wheel in the field behind me is one remnant of it. Ravenscliff was demolished in the 1970s, but the family actually built a townhouse in Caversham as well, and it survives. Constructed in 1865, the Fultons called it Lisburn House after their old hometown near Belfast in Ireland. Originally an Ayrshire family, the Fultons had crossed over to Ireland in the 17th century as part of the Protestant plantation of Ulster. James and Robert, however, were born in India, where their father was an officer in the Bengal artillery. Educated back in England, it was their mother who chose Otago as the family's next imperial destination. The Fultons were part of an extended family network of well-to-do Anglicans, along with the Valpys and their cousins the Jeffreys, many of whose members played significant roles in Otago history. As well as being a very competent farmer and runholder, James Fulton was a very public-spirited man who involved himself in the life of his community from an early point. He was one of the earliest justices of the peace. He was a resident magistrate, he was an active volunteer soldier, he was on the education board and later on the University of Otago Council. His wife Catherine, meanwhile, was equally active in social, political and religious affairs, including the campaign for women's suffrage, and kept detailed diaries that are an important record of life on the Tiree Plain through her lifetime. Most of the families we looked at so far came to Otago with at least a modicum of wealth to help themselves set up in the new colony. But it was another Tairi pioneer who was perhaps the poster boy for the making your fortune aspect of the Otago Association scheme. Donald Reid came from a Highland family and was born at Newton Pitcastle Farm just over the here on the hills above Strathtay in Perthshire in 1833. His family moved thereafter down to Edinburgh, but when his father died there in 1844, Donald was sent back to the family farm in Strathtay. But a few years later, he emigrated to Otago with his mother, his stepfather and two older brothers, coming on the Mary in 1849. He was just 16, with few resources, but plenty of grit and determination. Donald Reid began as a farm labourer working for Judge Valpy on his property at Forbury. But by the time he was 18, he'd saved enough money to buy some land of his own. He gradually added to those holdings, got married, and in 1856 he moved out here to the Tairi Plain to this property that he called Salisbury, after the Salisbury Crags of Edinburgh. Now the Reids began with a wattle and daub cottage like pretty much every other Tairi pioneer family, but as the family grew and their holdings and prosperity increased, they built a small brick house. So far, so typical. Many Tairi farmers in the pioneer era did exactly the same thing. But Donald Reid was not your average man. He was both a canny farmer and an astute judge of men. During the gold rush of 1861, for instance, he made a deal with his farm workers. They would all go up to the goldfields together, sharing the costs and splitting the profits, and when it was harvest time, they'd all come back down to the farm to do the work. It was a great way to deal with gold fever while also retaining the services of your workers. By the 1870s, Salisbury had developed into a model farming estate, and Reid commissioned Robert Lawson to design for him this fine mansion, one of the most impressive on the Tairi. Reid also became prominent as a provincial and then a national politician, serving for a time as Minister of Immigration in the 1870s. In his latter years, he also founded the stock and station agency Reid Farmers. But he was never as notable on the national stage as in Otago. Here, he was a man of huge mana, known for his unimpeachable integrity and epitomising all those values of hard work, thrift and honesty that were so esteemed by the Presbyterian Scots. Reid became the figurehead of the Otago Early Settlers Association and was made its president in 1900, serving in that role until his death in 1919. A few families pushed further south to the Tokomoriro Plain, and an even smaller number pushed on past the Clutha. Now this took some confidence given the extreme isolation and the distance from all sources of basic supplies and a market for their produce. Two young men who led that push south were the Chalmers brothers, Alexander and Nathaniel, from Rothsay Bay on the Isle of Bute, the sons of a doctor. The boys had grown up in London where their father was on the London Committee of the Otago Association, and he had bought them each land packages from the New Zealand Company in Otago. They set sail at the end of 1848 on the Ajax, aged just 22 and 19 respectively, but accompanied by the Hay family as their servants, and taking with them all the gear and provisions it was thought they would need to get a start in the new land. The rural properties they'd selected were here near Roma Harper, and Captain Cargill advised them not to take them up. Church and market, concentration and contiguity, he advised them, stick to the tens, by which he meant the 10-acre allotments near Dunedin that were also part of their packages, and reflecting Captain Cargill's strong desire for all the Otago settlers to be clustered close together. Now there was a lot of sense to that notion, especially when it came to building roads and bridges to service developing farms. But the Chalmers boys were undeterred and headed south regardless. Now that in itself involved an epic journey by heavily laden boats, then ferrying all the goods and gear into the bush. Must have been quite daunting for two middle-class boys who'd never swung an axe or milked a cow in their lives. but they seem to have kept a sense of humour, naming two hills near their property, Concentration and Contiguity, as a sort of geographical riposte to Captain Cargill's cautionary advice. Nathaniel Chalmers was one of the very few early settlers who showed any curiosity about what lay inland from the coastal strip of settlement. In 1853, he persuaded two Maori chiefs, Reko and Kaikoura, to guide him into the interior. Setting out from Tuturau, the three men went by the old Maori trails to Nokamai and the Nevis. After 6 days walking, Chalmers climbed to the top of a high ridge, and far to the northwest he spied a large body of water surrounded by snow-clad peaks. It was Lake Wakatipu, and Chalmers was the first European to see it. They then walked down to the Kawerau River, crossing it by the natural stone bridge near Roaring Meg. By the time they reached Lake Wanaka, Chalmers was sick and exhausted. He could go no further. So the two old chiefs put together a mokahi and they set off for the coast by the fastest way they knew, down the river. What a ride! Chalmers later recorded his terror at the whitewater journey through the Cromwell Gorge, but the old chiefs were completely unfazed and duly deposited him safely near the later site of Balclutha. Now, neither of the Chalmers brothers stayed in Otago long term. Alexander moved to Melbourne and Nathaniel to Fiji. But the stories of their early adventures here really typify the rough and tumble of pioneering life. I just love this description, for instance, by a traveller who called in on Nathaniel in his primitive South Otago hut in 1854.
He wore long hair, a red nightcap, a leather jacket and dungaree trousers of his own making. A tight fit in spite of his many additions.
New settlers continued to arrive in Otago even during these years of stagnation. They tended to be determined men and women of at least moderate means. John Reid's a very good example. He was born here in Longside near Peterhead in Aberdeenshire and had just begun his secondary education as a boarder at the Kimley Academy when his father died in an accident in 1832. Life then became much harder for John Reid as his eldest son. He took over his father's business as an agricultural implement manufacturer, apprenticing himself to an experienced foreman and supporting the family. He came out to Otago on the Pudsey Dawson in 1854. After his arrival, Reid built himself a basic hut here at what was then the mouth of the Leith in a long reclaimed part of the Dunedin foreshore called Palasha Bay. He spent the next year droving mobs of cattle up from southern where settlement had also now begun to Dunedin. But before a full year had passed, he went back to Scotland to get married. Now that was unusual, but not entirely unique, and you'd have to imagine it was part of some pre-arranged plan with the young woman concerned, whose name was Mary Gall. She was also from Aberdeenshire. In 1857, he came back to Otago with his wife, extended the hunt in Palasha Bay, took up a dairy farm in North East Valley, then went to work in the Otago Survey Office as its chief draftsman. He made the province's first lithographic maps in his day job, but was also the first to drive a milk cart into Dunedin in his after-hours activities. A few years later, he went storekeeping at Gabriel's Gully, then developed a successful merchant store in Dunedin, while also engaging in land development with a big farm at Merton. Eventually he established a highly successful land survey and estate agency, and he brought his sons into the business as well. So John Reid and Sons were at the heart of Dunedin's suburban expansion in the 1870s and 80s and made a significant contribution to that great development. Now in that, I think he exemplifies that great Scottish stereotype of the ladder parts. A boy of relatively humble origins who, thanks to his education, is able to rise to great heights. Boys like that had ample opportunities in the colonies to rise, and John Reid certainly took his. Moreover, it was in a room in his office in the Exchange building in Liverpool Street that the museum had its very first base, effectively where the museum began. Reid was a foundational committee member and its second president. Now, this fantastic building was designed by the Dunedin architect Frank Peter of St Clair. And if you then consider that humble wattle and daub cottage along the foreshore that had been John Reid's very first base in the colony and compare it to this, you could almost say that's a symbol of the lifetime transition that was the journey to New Edinburgh.